me, it looks like there are some people already who've already been waiting. So let me know if you can see this. I'm doing this stream for the first time from my cell phone, or a live stream from my cell phone at least. So I'd like to see if the chats are working and all of that. Um, all right, well, I hope all of you had a very merry and a very blessed Christmas, and that the new year 2025 would be a very good and a very prosperous year. I see some people are responding to the video. I see some likes coming in. So looks like we're well. Oh, okay, some chats are coming in. I can see where they are now. Before we jump into the topic of this video, I want to say that this is the first live video. Greetings, Marco and Zach. This is the first live video of 2025, and we plan on doing much more of these videos. And I'll leave some remarks about that in a few moments, but this is not the first video on this channel for this year. So while you are here, I'd like to encourage you to go and watch actually the two videos or two interviews I did with Jaco Kleinans about the extent to which the world is changing, and especially how politics is shifting all over the world. The first video was published towards the end of last year, 27 or 28 December, about especially America, the American elections, how to make sense of that. And the second half was published earlier this year about Europe mostly, and Europe's swing to the right. Now, if you haven't watched that yet, I can encourage you to do so. And I do think that Jaco Kleinans is the best analyst in South Africa when it comes to international news and international developments. And there's an important reason why I say so, not simply because he's a friend and a colleague and I know him very well, but because Jaco has the ability to distinguish between facts and trends, or what you might describe as waves and tides. And what really annoys me about analysts nowadays is most analysts, or many analysts, simply convey what they read in the news. They would be called onto a television network to talk about the war in Ukraine, for example, and they would only explain what they had read in the New York Times or something to that effect, when oftentimes what viewers and what people want is not simply to know about the most recent facts. Yes, that's also important, but to help people to understand how these facts fit in together. Or people don't simply want to know what the wave looks like, they want to understand the tide. And I think these two videos that we published do this very well, or Jaco at least did this very well, talking about America's election, changes in America, but then also changes in Europe. All right, so let's get into this video. As I mentioned, this is the first time I'm doing a live stream from my cell phone. I see there was a function to set a goal for super chats. So I tried that now. I think I set the goal at 5 super chats, and there's a function where you can say how will you celebrate that, or what will you do if you achieve that. And so there's a lot that could be said about Orania. And I'm not even going to try to say most of it. Or I'm only going to focus on one or two important things in this video because I want to keep it short. But there's some very interesting information about Orania's growth, about recent census data, projections about Orania, what it would look like in the future, and so forth. And so perhaps we can do that. I think we can regard super chats as an indication of whether people would be interested in seeing a follow-up video that is a bit more factual and about numbers, statistics with regard to Orania and so forth. All right, I am sitting here in a place called Stokkiesdraai, which is a park in the northwestern part of Orania. It's very quiet, as you can see. It's because it's Sunday, and because in Orania people rest on Sundays. So Sunday is a very quiet, peaceful day in Orania. We just went for a drive. I went for a drive with my son. I'm actually teaching him to drive right now, and there are some very quiet parts, not just on the main road, but also on other roads, quiet roads. And it's a very peaceful time of day. The swimming pool was open. People could go to the public pool. The parks are open, public areas, but most businesses are closed. And so again, it's quite peaceful in Orania on a Sunday. And so let me say something about why Orania was established, and then I'll make some remarks about where Orania is today. And so there's a very interesting history behind Orania, and I'm not going to try to get into that. I did discuss some of it about a year ago, slightly less than a year ago, on this channel with Joost Strydom. It was one of the first episodes of the Pioneer podcast before we started doing video episodes. So it's just audio, and we'll do some follow-ups if you guys are interested in that in this coming year. So I'm not going to go into the detail of the history of Orania, and there are people who can explain that history much better than me. But what I would say is that in the 1980s, even in the 70s already in South Africa, there was a growing consensus in South Africa, especially among Afrikaners, that the political system at the time wasn't working. The apartheid system, or the system of separate development, might have been initiated with the idea of giving homelands to different peoples and so forth, but it clearly wasn't working, and it was clearly doomed to fail. And so the argument was not so much whether it ought to be ended, but how it ought to be ended. And unfortunately, South Africa suffered at that time from a false dichotomy, which is very prevalent up to this very day. And we've discussed this in some of the podcast interviews on this channel before, where the belief, at least the way it manifests today, is that people have some form of choice, but it's only two options. You can only choose between the political system that South Africa had in the previous dispensation and the system of the current dispensation. And so one commentator who used to be a judge remarked that it's a choice between an immoral system that is efficient as opposed to a moral system that is inefficient or that isn't working. But the problem with that is that there are many other options, and there could be many other options. When we talk about political systems, systems of government and so forth, it's never just a choice between two options. And so in South Africa, it's presented as a choice between the apartheid system and an ANC government, an African or black nationalist socialist government. And it's strange to see, I mentioned analysts earlier in this video, how many analysts still believe in this false dichotomy. And Orania was started as a way of saying that we don't need to go for either one of those two options. And it was started back in the 1980s. At the time, it was regarded by many people as a strange initiative. And only in the last decade or so did Orania really start to experience substantial growth. Because the concern at the time, and again, going back to the point I made about waves and tides, was that Karel Boshoff, Professor Karel Boshoff, the founder of Orania, or one of the founders, was concerned that people were only looking at the short-term facts or the waves and not at the tides, not at the macro trends happening in South Africa. And so one example of that was the ideology of the ANC, who became the ruling party in South Africa, who was very open about the fact that they are aligned with communist principles. They were aligned with the South African Communist Party. They spoke about implementing a national democratic revolution at the time, and they still do. The South African Communist Party boasted about the fact that they were the ideological engine of the ANC. And despite that, the ANC, or together with that, or combined with that, the ANC leadership, especially towards the end of the 1980s, spoke in a very reconciliatory tone. So a lot of people interpreted this as, well, these people are going to govern South Africa responsibly. They published a document called Ready to Govern. And people like ANC leaders, like Nelson Mandela, obviously, but also people like Thabo Mbeki and Cyril Ramaphosa and so forth, really inspired people all over the world to trust them, that they would govern South Africa responsibly. But that's a typical example of looking only at the waves but not at the tide. The tide, in this case, is that No communist aligned government or socialist aligned government has been able to achieve success, to govern successfully or responsibly anywhere in the world. The tide says to us that a government or a movement, a liberation movement that is very good at struggling, at struggle, political struggle, at protests, at setting things on fire, and so forth, are almost never competent when it comes to governing efficiently. But yet, much of the world believed that the ANC would be a responsible, healthy government. And so, Orania, and this is important to mention, was not established merely as a reaction to, and I'm not Orania's spokesperson, but this is what I gather from conversations with people, the leadership in Orania and so forth. It's not merely an alternative to South Africa. That's not the point. The point was, and still is, that there was a concern already in the 80s and the 90s, and especially now, that cultural communities in South Africa would not have much of a future if they do not care for themselves, if they do not take action and take responsibility for their own futures. Because the ideology that underpins the South African government is very much an ideology that says that the South African, being a South African, is your primary identity. And that's fine, but it becomes a problem when you are being told that your cultural identity is by definition a problem. When you hear people in government or the ruling party talking about the backwardness of community identity or cultural identities, and that you have to abandon your cultural identity to take up your South African identity. So this is in some ways an experiment in globalism, South Africa as we know it today. And Orania's solution to that is to say, well, let's build our own community where the Afrikaner people are a majority, where we create a de facto reality of governing ourselves merely because it's our community. We've built it ourselves, we populate it, and we make our own decisions in this community. And so there's a saying that unusual or abnormal circumstances lead to unusual or abnormal solutions. And so in some ways, Orania is an abnormal solution as an attempt to ensure a future for Afrikaner culture in South Africa. But it's largely because it has been created among abnormal circumstances. And what I mean when I say abnormal circumstances is circumstances in which your natural identity is under pressure. The fact that you are an Afrikaner was not just frowned upon a few decades ago, but regarded as inappropriate. And even today, attaching value to your cultural identity is something that is frowned upon, looked down on in South Africa, especially by the South African political system, because the political system incentivizes us to abandon our cultural identities. And so the Orania system is private property. It's private land that is expanded, where you can buy a piece of land if you are an Afrikaner, if you make it clear that you buy into the ideal of Afrikaner freedom and the ideals that are stipulated in according to Orania, or the leadership of Orania. But what is very significant about Orania is two things additionally that I want to mention. The first is the strange or bizarre, I would say, cases of media coverage that Orania has received over the years. It's the most bizarre examples that I can think of has been journalists, and I have to say, especially white liberal European journalists, especially more than anyone else, coming to Orania, reporting on what is happening here, and then publishing a completely distorted picture. And in many cases being very malicious, interviewing little children without the consent of their parents and so forth. And so Orania has gotten to a point where even though they, internationally speaking, they often get bad publicity, they get a significant amount of support, not just from the Afrikaner community, but from people in South Africa. And you see that it's a very striking comparison to see the type of coverage Orania gets when mainstream media outlets come to this place, as opposed to when podcasters come to Orania. Almost always, podcasters would be very positive about their experience, especially when they are black podcasters, South African podcasters, and so forth. And when it's mainstream journalists, oftentimes they find that the coverage they get is negative. And so there's been some strange cases. I'm not going into that. We discussed some of that in my discussion with Joost Strydom earlier. But the second thing, and this is the most important point that I want to mention about Orania and why I think it's working. Obviously, any project like this has its challenges, it has its ups and downs, it has difficulties that it has to overcome, it has external threats, it has internal challenges that it has to deal with. All of that is normal and natural. But the most important thing here is something I mentioned earlier in this video is Orania is creating a de facto reality. And this is an important principle of politics and law that unfortunately a lot of people don't seem to understand. Is people, too many people, especially in the Western world, but in much of the rest of the world as well, think that the way to create a better life for your community is by changing de jure realities. In other words, changing the law, organizing protest marches to convince the government to change a particular law and so forth. And that's very important. I'm not saying that it isn't. It's important to put pressure on the government to ensure that you have proper policy and that you can function in a proper policy environment. But the other side of it is at least as important, if not more important, and that is the de facto side. It is simply building realities from the ground up. And so when it comes to questions like self-determination or self-governance, it's a very good example of this. But the same could be said about the question of private cities, which is becoming an increasingly popular notion all over the world, or charter cities. Is the de facto, or let's start with the de jure. The de jure approach to something like this is to draw up petitions, to draw up constitutional papers, to start writing policies and so forth, and then trying to convince the government that they should allow you to do this. And we see many of these private cities, institutions all over the world trying to implement their ideas in this way. The de facto approach is the other way around. It's to say, let's just build it. Let's create a reality until it's something that cannot be ignored anymore. And so this is not a choice. It's not a choice between the de facto and the de jure side. You have to do both. You have to recognize the legal framework within which you are operating. You have to pressure for a healthy and a sustainable policy environment. You have to go to court. You have to do all of these things. But combined with that, you have to build your own realities, create your own realities. And so there's a saying here in Orania that one of the most important things you can do for freedom in Orania is to dig a ditch to lay down infrastructure, to lay down pipes, sewage systems, electrical wiring and all of that. Because that's the only real sustainable way in which a new reality, if I can use that term, can be built. It's not legislated into existence, but built into existence. And so I believe that there are many other things that could be said about Orania, but I believe that that is the most important reason why Orania has proven itself to be something, a community that should be taken seriously, why its support is growing substantially within South Africa, among Afrikaners, among people who aren't Afrikaners, who have no interest in living here, but who support the idea or who are optimistic about the idea, but also internationally, people all over the world looking at Orania and saying, well, this is something that we should take seriously. So that's it. That's my story. Thank you very much. Please let me know what you think. I'm going to have a look at the comments, and if there's enough interest in this topic, I might do a follow-up. Thank you very much.